The photographs do not lie, even when the people in them have spent decades perfecting the art of lying with their faces. There is one image, grainy at its edges, slightly overexposed the way palace photographers sometimes allow when the moment is too human to sharpen, that has circulated quietly among royal watchers for years without ever quite finding the explanation it deserves. In it, King Charles III stands at the top of a grand staircase at Windsor. To his left is Camilla, his wife of many years, the woman he once said he could not live without, the woman a nation spent 20 years hating on behalf of a dead princess. To his right is Catherine, Princess of Wales, his daughter-in-law, composed as always, luminous in that particular way of hers that makes cameras behave as though they are grateful. Charles's hand reaches right. Not dramatically. Not obviously. Just slightly, just enough, a small involuntary lean of the body toward Catherine, a tilt that his own face does not register and his own mind may not have acknowledged. Camilla looks forward. Catherine looks forward. Charles alone seems to be doing two things at once, standing still and reaching, all at the same time. The silence in that image said everything. To understand what that silence meant, you have to go back further than most people are willing to go. You have to go back past the wedding at Windsor Castle in 2005, past the funeral that shook the world in 1997, past even the early glamorous years of the 1980s when Diana Spencer stepped out of a carriage and the whole planet inhaled. You have to go back to the Charles that existed before all of it, the boy who grew up inside a palace that treated warmth as a security risk, who was sent away to boarding school at a time when what he needed most was to be held, who learned that love was something you performed for duty rather than something you fell into because you could not help yourself. That boy became a man who spent his whole life reaching for something he could name but never quite hold. He reached for Diana first. Not because he loved her, not in the beginning. Anyway, not in the way love requires a kind of reckless recognition of another person's wholeness, but because she was what the institution required of him and because some part of him believed that doing the right thing would eventually feel like the right thing. It did not. The marriage became its own kind of warfare, politely conducted in drawing rooms and publicly conducted through journalists who were fed information like trained animals at specific hours. Diana was fire. Everyone who ever stood near her said so afterward, long after the fire had gone out. She burned with feeling the way certain people do who have never learned that feeling is supposed to be managed, contained, expressed only in approved quantities at approved times. She burned and Charles, who had been taught his whole life to be controlled, to be measured, to be the portrait of himself rather than the actual man, could not match her. Could not even approach the altitude of her emotion without something in him seizing up like a machine that has been asked to do something it was not built for. So he reached for Camilla. Camilla Parker Bowles had known Charles before Diana was even a consideration. She was older, assured, earthy in a way that the palace world respected without advertising, the kind of woman who could make a man feel like the smartest person in the room by simply paying attention to what he actually said rather than what he was supposed to say. With Camilla, Charles did not have to be the Prince of Wales. He could be Charles. Fumbling, earnest, passionate about architecture and organic farming and watercolors that the public found endearing and the critics found underwhelming. Camilla laughed at the right moments. She held space for his seriousness without making him feel heavy. Their relationship survived Diana. It survived the scandal, the taped phone calls, the public disgust, the years of calculated distance while Diana lived and the slower, more careful rehabilitation that followed her death. It survived because Camilla was, at her core, consistent. She did not require Charles to be anything other than what he was. And Charles, after a lifetime of being required to be things, found that consistency more intoxicating than any romance. They married quietly, practically, in a register office rather than a cathedral, as if even the ceremony understood that this was not a fairy tale but something more durable, a pragmatic love, a love of parallel gardens and shared evening walks and the particular peace of two people who have simply decided to stop pretending they do not belong together. For years it seemed settled. And then, William married Catherine Middleton, and something shifted in the architecture of the family that no one quite had language for. Catherine Kate, as the world called her, though she had been quietly moving away from that shorthand as she stepped further into the role that history was building around her, was not like Diana in the ways that mattered for comparison. She was not combustible. She was not a wound walking around in expensive clothes. She had grown up in a family where people said what they meant and meant what they said, where Christmas was loud and affectionate and no one kept score of whose feelings were being managed and whose were being sacrificed. She came into the Windsor family already whole, which was the most unusual and quietly revolutionary thing anyone had brought into that house in generations. Charles watched her. Not in any way that could be called inappropriate or even conscious. He watched her the way a man watches someone doing something he was never taught to do and has always suspected he needed to learn, with a quality of attention that is almost hunger but is really something sadder, something closer to recognition. He watched the way she moved through formal engagements without disappearing into them, the way she could be royal and real at the same time, the way she touched William's arm in public, and it did not look like performance but like reflex, like something her body did before her brain could decide whether it was appropriate. He watched her with his children. George and Charlotte and Louis, the grandchildren he was slowly learning to be present for in ways he had not been present for William and Harry. Catherine made space for him with those children. She did not wall him out the way palace dynamics and his own failures as a father might have justified. She handed him the grandchildren with a naturalness that cost her something. He could see it, the slight deliberateness of it, the choice she was making to include him rather than the easier choice to keep a careful distance, and he received them with a gratitude he did not always know how to express. The reach in that photograph. It was not romantic. Let that be clear, absolutely clear, because clarity matters in the space where the tabloids prefer fog. It was not romantic in any simple or scandalous sense. It was something older and stranger and more painful than romance. It was a man in his 70s reaching toward the person in his family who most reminded him of what his family could have been, what he could have been, if any of them had been raised with the particular kind of grace that Catherine carried without seeming to know she was carrying it. It was a man reaching toward his own unrealized life. Camilla saw it. Of course she saw it. Camilla was not a foolish woman and had never been. She had spent decades reading Charles's body the way a translator reads between languages, not just what he said but the angle of the saying, the temperature of it, the thing underneath the thing. She had watched him with Diana and understood, even then, that what broke between Charles and Diana was not simply incompatibility but a kind of fundamental mismatch in what each of them needed love to be. Diana needed love to be a mirror, something that reflected her back to herself in the most vivid possible terms. Charles needed love to be a room of quiet, warm, with good light, where he could simply exist without being evaluated. Camilla had always been a room. Catherine was something different. Catherine was a window. And Charles, who had lived in rooms his whole life, had started pressing his hand against the glass. The silence in that image was not the silence of a secret. It was the silence of something too complex for language, too layered for the vocabulary of scandal that the press would reach for if they noticed. It was the silence of a man who had gotten most of what he wanted and understood, too late and too clearly, that wanting had never been his problem. Reaching had always been his problem. He had reached for Camilla when he should have stayed. He had stayed with Diana when he should have left. He had been distant from his sons when they needed him near and he had been near when they needed distance, and now here he was, King of England, standing at the top of a staircase, reaching toward a woman who was not his wife, not his lover, not his anything except the daughter-in-law who had, without trying, become the clearest reflection of everything the Windsor family had always been too proud and too frightened and too well trained to be. The staircase was grand. The carpet was red. The chandeliers overhead cost more than most people's houses. His hand reached right. And the silence said everything that Charles, across 74 years of exquisite public training, had never once learned how to say. What the public saw in the weeks surrounding that photograph was the standard pageantry, the state occasions, the investitures, the careful choreography of monarchy going about its business with appropriate solemnity. What they did not see, because it happened in the small margins between the events, in the cars between venues and the back hallways between rooms, was the quality of attention that Charles brought to Catherine in those private intervals. The way he would pause a conversation to make sure she had been asked the right question. The way he would notice when she was flagging, and she flagged, sometimes, in the way all of them flagged beneath the weight of the institution, and find some small way to acknowledge it without making it visible to the room. He had not done this with Diana. He had not known how to do this with Diana. He had watched Diana struggle and responded with irritation and helplessness in equal measure, and the irritation had won, and the helplessness had calcified into distance, and the distance had become the permanent architecture of that marriage long before either of them admitted it aloud. With Catherine he was different. He was older, yes. He had learned things. But it was more than that. Catherine made it easier to be better because she did not seem to require it the way Diana had required it, desperately, urgently, with the specific urgency of someone who had not been enough to her own family and needed someone else to make up the deficit. Catherine did not require Charles to complete her. She was already complete. What she offered him was simply the chance to be present, and presence, for Charles, had always been the hardest thing. He was learning it. Slowly. Imperfectly. With the particular clumsiness of a man who has spent his whole life being told that emotion is a private matter and is only now, at the end of his active life, discovering that privacy of that kind is just another word for loneliness. Camilla watched him learning. She said nothing. She was too intelligent for the kind of jealousy that requires a scene. But there were moments, small ones, the kind that only two people who had been together long enough to read each other in shorthand would register, where she looked at Charles looking at Catherine, and something moved through her face that was not anger and was not hurt but was something quiet and resigned, like a woman watching the tide go where it was always going to go and understanding that the tide is not doing it to hurt her. It was just doing what tides do. The reaching was not a betrayal. Not in the conventional sense of the word. It was something more intimate than betrayal, more private than scandal. It was a man encountering, inside his own family, the ghost of his own unlived life. The warmth he had never been shown. The ease he had never been taught. The grace under pressure that he had always aspired to and never quite achieved, standing right there at family dinners and Christmas gatherings and state occasions, wearing a blue dress and smiling at his grandchildren like it was the most natural thing in the world. Because for her, it was. That was the thing that undid him, quietly, repeatedly, without fanfare. For Catherine, it was simply natural. There is a particular kind of grief that has no name in English, though several other languages have tried to build one. It is the grief not for what you lost but for what you never had, the ghost of a life that ran parallel to yours, that you could almost see through the window on certain days, that looked warmer and louder and more real than the one you were actually living. Grief for the unlived. Grief for the unchosen version of yourself that you glimpse sometimes in the people around you who got it right without even trying. Charles had been carrying this grief since before he could name it. He carried it through the 1970s when his relationship with Camilla first began, carried it as a young man who was already being asked to sacrifice the personal for the institutional, who was already being shaped by forces older and more powerful than his own desires. He carried it through the terrible theater of the 1980s, through the wedding and the honeymoon and the early years of marriage that should have been good and instead were a masterclass in two people failing to reach each other across a distance that neither of them had agreed to but both of them had, in their different ways, created. He carried it through Diana's death, through the silence that followed, through the long careful rehabilitation of his own public image that took the better part of a decade and a lot of quiet, consistent work. He was still carrying it when he became king. The crown changed things in the way that large, heavy objects tend to change the people they are placed upon. It did not transform Charles into a different person, but it pressed him further into the shape he had always been becoming. More formal in some ways. More exposed in others. The job of being king, unlike the job of being Prince of Wales, left no room for the performance of waiting. There was nothing left to wait for. Every preparation he had made across 7 decades was now the present tense, not the future, and the present tense has a way of clarifying what was always true underneath all the preparation. What had always been true was this: Charles wanted to be loved in the way that he had never quite been loved. Not worshipped. Diana had been worshipped and it destroyed her. Not admired. He had been admired his whole life and it had done him no particular good. He wanted to be loved with ease, with the uncomplicated warmth that comes from a family that actually knows how to be a family, that has arguments and reconciliations and loud Christmases and the kind of history that is comfortable enough to joke about. He had built a life with Camilla that was close to this. Closer than anything he had managed before. Camilla gave him ease. But ease, he was discovering, was not quite the same as warmth. Ease was the absence of friction. Warmth was a presence, an active thing, a fire rather than a still room. Catherine was warm. She was warm in the structural sense, the way she organized herself around her children, the way she made William into a better version of himself simply by being the person she was, the way she treated every formal occasion as an opportunity to be genuinely interested in the people she was required to meet, rather than the opportunity to perform interest that it became for so many of them. She was warm in the way Charles's mother had never been warm or had been warm in such private, hidden ways that it amounted, for the people around her, to a kind of coldness. She was warm in the way his father had been specifically incapable of warm. She was warm in the way he himself had always wanted to be and had always, for reasons too structural and too old to easily dismantle, fallen short of. She was the thing the Windsor family kept trying to produce and kept failing to produce. And William, somehow, had found her. Had found her and held on to her when a less stubborn or less perceptive man might have let the institution push her out the way institutions push out anything that does not conform to their particular shape. William had fought for Catherine in the way Charles had not known how to fight for what he wanted, not against enemies but against the slow erosion of self that palace life tends to accomplish through patience and repetition. Charles watched his son fight for his wife and felt something he was not prepared for. Pride, yes. But, underneath the pride, something more uncomfortable. A recognition. The recognition of a man seeing in his son the thing he had not managed to be, someone who chose, clearly and repeatedly and, without apology, the person they loved over the image they were supposed to present. William had made mistakes, yes. The relationship with Harry had fractured in ways that still bled at the edges when pressed. But, with Catherine, William had been, from very early, absolutely clear. She was his. He was not willing to perform otherwise. Charles had never been clear like that. Not once in his entire life. He had been clear that he loved Camilla. But, he had expressed that clarity in a way that cost everyone around him, Diana most of all, but also his sons, also the institution, also, in some quieter way that people talked about less, Camilla herself, who had spent 2 decades in the outer orbit of his life waiting for a space that kept not materializing. His clarity had been private and his behavior had been public, and they had pointed in different directions for so long that the contradiction had become the defining story of his life. Now here was his son, being clear in both directions at once. And here was Catherine, the person his son had chosen to be clear about, standing inside the family with a warmth and a wholeness that made Charles feel, sometimes, like he had arrived very late to a party that had been going on without him. This was the emotional texture of those years, not crisis, not scandal, not the clean dramatic lines of what the tabloids preferred. It was quieter and more real than that. It was a man in his 70s slowly understanding the shape of what he had missed, surrounded by the people who most clearly embodied that shape, trying to learn something that is very difficult to learn at 70 and that most people either have by 40 or do not have at all. He tried to learn it with the grandchildren. George first, who was serious in the way that Charles recognized from the inside the gravity of a child who has understood very early that they are being watched, that the watching is permanent, that performance is the price of existence in this particular family. Charles looked at George and saw himself at 8 years old, already carrying something too heavy for his frame, and felt a complicated tenderness that he did not entirely know what to do with. He tried to be with George in ways his own father had not been with him. He tried to be interested in what George was actually interested in rather than what he thought a future king should be interested in. He tried to listen more than he instructed. Catherine watched him try. She did not comment on it. She did not offer him advice or praise him when he got it right. She simply made the space available, included him in the ordinary afternoons, the walks, the meals, the unscripted hours that are where families actually happen as opposed to where they perform happening, and let him find his own way into it. The generosity of this was enormous. It was the generosity of someone who understood that Charles needed to arrive at these things himself, that any pushing would cause him to retreat into the dignified distance that was his oldest and most practiced defense. She gave him room to be clumsy. Nobody had ever given Charles room to be clumsy. The institution had required him to be correct. Diana had required him to be feeling. Even Camilla, who accepted him more completely than anyone, had always required him to be the Charles she knew, the specific man she had loved for 40 years, which meant there was not always room for the Charles he was still becoming, the stranger who showed up sometimes in quieter moments and surprised them both. Catherine gave him room for the stranger. It was probably this, more than any photograph, more than any visible gesture of preference, that explained the lean in that image at Windsor. It was not about what he was reaching toward. It was about what she had made him feel was reachable. Camilla noticed the change in him before he noticed it himself. She noticed it the way long-term partners notice everything eventually, not through dramatic confrontation but through the accumulation of small discrepancies. The way he talked about the grandchildren with a softness in his voice that had not been there 5 years earlier. The way he mentioned Catherine in passing, not frequently, not with any particular emphasis, but with a quality of attention that was different from the quality he applied to other subjects, slightly more careful, slightly more present. The way he sometimes seemed, in the evenings, to be thinking about something he had not brought into the room with him, some conversation or moment or observation that he was still carrying. She had known Charles for most of her adult life. She could read him the way you read a book you have memorized, not word by word but, atmospherically, by the temperature of the prose. The temperature had changed. She did not call it what it would have been convenient to call it. She did not call it a betrayal or a preference or a falling away from her. She was too honest for the convenient label. What she called it, in the privacy of her own mind, in the long evenings when Charles was in his study and she was in hers and the house was full of the particular silence of two people who had been together long enough to live in parallel, what she called it was simply Charles. This was simply Charles. This was what Charles did, reached for things slightly beyond his grasp, loved people in ways that were real but incomplete, leaned toward warmth with the body of a man who had been taught to stand straight and still. She had watched him do this his entire life. She had watched him do it with Diana, differently, more catastrophically, with the energy of a man trying to fix something he could not fix. This was softer. This was not destructive. This was just Charles in his later years finding, in his daughter-in-law, a version of what he had always wanted to be part of and had never quite been. She was not threatened by it. She was something more complicated than threatened. She was a woman sitting with the full understanding of another person's longing, understanding it with the empathy of a long marriage and the intelligence of a woman who had never been naive about what love costs and what it cannot always provide, and finding that understanding, while accurate, was also painful in its own quiet way. Not because Charles was choosing Catherine over her. He was not. He would never. The pull toward Catherine was not the kind of pull that ends marriages or redraws the lines of a life. It was something smaller and, in some ways sadder than that, a man warming his hands at a fire that belonged to someone else. Camilla held her own fire. She had always held her own fire. She simply noticed, with a clarity she had not asked for and could not unknow, that Charles sometimes looked at the other one. The world outside the palace was running its own parallel story. Catherine was becoming something the public had not quite encountered before in the royal family, a figure who managed to be beloved without being tragic. Diana had been beloved, enormously, consuming, but the love was inseparable from the tragedy, from the sense of watching someone be hurt in public, from the particular anguish of a beautiful person being failed by the institutions that were supposed to protect them. People loved Diana the way they loved stories that end badly, fully, painfully, with the specific grief of knowing how it goes. Catherine they loved differently. They loved her the way you love something that seems to be working, with relief as much as affection, with a kind of gratitude that the story this time appeared to be a different kind of story. She was stylish without using style as armor. She was warm in public without being confessional. She kept her private life genuinely private without it seeming like a performance of privacy, a distinction that sounds obvious and is actually extraordinarily difficult to achieve inside the machinery of royal public life. She made people believe that the institution could produce a human being. This was, historically, not a reasonable thing to believe. Charles believed it. Watching Catherine move through the public role that was now fully hers, not as a future queen consort but as the Princess of Wales, inheriting the title and the expectations and the particular weight of comparison that came with it, all that Diana shadowed, Charles felt something he had not expected to feel. Hope. Not for himself specifically. Not the personal kind of hope. Something more abstract and, more important, hope that the thing he had given his life to, the institution that had shaped him and constrained him and cost him things he could not always name, might not be as cold and as human grinding as he had sometimes feared. That the family he had built, imperfectly, with cost and consequence, was producing something worth building. The hope felt, at times, indistinguishable from love. And love, for Charles, had always been a kind of reaching. The year Catherine got sick, something cracked open inside the Windsor family that no amount of protocol could plaster back over. Cancer does that. It takes everything that has been carefully arranged, the formal distance, the managed appearances, the architecture of a family that has learned to function through performance rather than feeling, and it strips the arrangement down to what is actually there underneath. What is actually there is either something or it is nothing, and the discovery of which one it is tends to happen fast, in corridors and waiting rooms and phone calls received at inconvenient hours. What was actually there in Charles's relationship with Catherine, the relationship the photograph had hinted at and the silence had confirmed, was not nothing. He called more. He visited without waiting to be asked. He sent things, books, notes, small offerings in the particular language of a man who has always been better at gesture than at speech, and the gesture of each one said, "I see you," and "I am here," and "this matters," without any of those words ever appearing, because Charles would not use those words, had never used those words comfortably, had been trained out of directness in the emotional register so completely and so early that the training was now bone. But the gesture was real. The gesture, for once, was not performance. Catherine received it the way she received most things, with composure and with a genuine warmth underneath the composure that made the composure feel like a frame rather than a mask. She did not make much of it. She did not turn it into a narrative about the family improving or Charles evolving or the Windsors finally learning something. She simply received the care and returned it in the small ways available to someone who was unwell and conserving energy, a note, a response, the particular kind of quiet attention that says your gesture landed. William watched his father show up. This was its own complicated thing. The relationship between Charles and William had been, there is no kind word for it, genuinely difficult. Not in the way that Charles and Harry's relationship had become difficult, which was loud and public and attended by lawyers and memoirs and the specific modern machinery of airing grievances in ways designed to reach maximum audience. The Charles and William difficulty was quieter. It was the difficulty of two serious men who were too alike in the wrong ways and too different in the ways that mattered for easy closeness, who had spent decades occupying positions of nearly identical duty but separated by a generation and a crown, and who had never quite figured out how to be father and son rather than king-in-waiting and future king-in-waiting. William did not naturally make space for vulnerability. Neither did Charles. When Catherine got sick, they were both forced into a situation where vulnerability was simply the condition of being alive and present, where there was no version of getting through it that did not involve being openly and uncomplicatedly there for another person. For William, this was available to him. He had built a marriage that had taught him how to be present. He had years of practice, years of Catherine teaching him by example and by the particular patience of a woman who understood that the man she loved needed to grow toward things rather than be pushed toward them. For Charles, it was harder and more necessary. He arrived at Catherine's bedside, not the literal bedside, because she managed her illness with the precision and privacy that characterized everything else she did, and the actual physical details were kept close, kept private, kept away from the cameras, but he arrived in the figurative sense that matters more. He arrived in the sense of being present to the weight of it, of not retreating into the institution's preferred response, which was to express appropriate concern through appropriate channels and continue with the appropriate schedule. He did not continue with the appropriate schedule. He adjusted. He rearranged. He made the quiet, unannounced decisions that people who love someone make when that someone is in trouble, the prioritizations that happen below the level of public record, the small clearings of space in an impossible timetable. He did this without announcement, without the press release that would have turned the gesture into performance, without the careful framing that Palace Communications had spent decades perfecting. He simply did it. Camilla watched him do it, and somewhere in the watching, somewhere in the quiet evenings when Charles was on the phone with William or had rearranged his afternoon to accommodate something connected to Catherine's treatment or recovery, Camilla made peace with what she was seeing in a way that was the final and most complete version of the peace she had been making with it for years. She had always understood Charles's limitations. She had loved him precisely because she understood them, not despite the limitations but with a clear-eyed comprehension of what they were and where they came from and what could be expected. She had never expected him to be fully available, not in the way that some women need a man to be fully available. She had built her life alongside his rather than inside it, two people moving in close and complementary orbits, warm and consistent, without requiring the kind of merger that destroys individual selves. But, watching him with Catherine's illness, she saw something she had not previously seen. She saw Charles being fully available. Not managing his availability, not allocating it according to the schedule of duties, not performing presence while reserving the actual self for later. She saw him present, genuinely present, in the way she had always known he was capable of being and had waited years to see him be. She had seen it with Camilla herself, in the early days. She had seen it in flashes, when the two of them were alone and the performance of being themselves could relax and something more real could move through the room. But it had always been partial. Always, at some level, mediated by the institution, by the decades of training, by the particular emotional rigidity that growing up Windsor seemed to install as irreversible firmware. With Catherine's illness, the firmware cracked. Charles was afraid. This was the thing underneath everything else, underneath the reaching in the photograph, underneath the change in temperature that Camilla had registered, underneath the calls and the rearranged schedules and the small gestures in the language of books and notes. Charles was afraid, and he was not afraid in the way he was afraid of institutional failure or public disapproval or the slow erosion of the monarchy's relevance, all fears he had carried professionally for decades. He was afraid in the personal sense. In the human sense. In the sense of a man who had found, inside his own family, the warmth he had always been reaching toward, and was now watching that warmth become fragile. He was afraid of losing Catherine the way you fear losing the thing that taught you what you should have been looking for all along. This is not a pretty fear. It is not the fear of a good man or a bad man. It is the fear of a particular kind of man, one who arrives late to the understanding of what matters, who arrives just as it becomes possible that the thing he now understands might be taken away, and who has to stand with that timing and not collapse under the cruelty of it. Charles stood with it. He did not collapse. He did not perform composure either, not entirely. There were people around him who would later speak, in the careful way of people who know they are speaking for the record, about a quality of feeling in Charles during those months that they had not previously encountered. A rawness. Not Charles the institution but Charles the man, somewhat visible at the seams. Catherine recovered. She recovered the way she did everything, with enormous reserve and controlled grace, letting the world know what was necessary and nothing more, protecting her family by protecting her own privacy, managing the narrative without making the management visible. She came back to public life in stages, each one calibrated, each one genuinely felt rather than performed, and the public received her return with a warmth that was almost reverent. They had been afraid too. They had not quite known they were afraid until they saw her standing at the Chelsea Flower Show looking like herself, and the fear released, and they understood only then how much they had been holding. Charles stood at a garden event that season and watched her. He watched her move through the people who were so glad to see her, watched her do the thing she always did, actually talking to them, actually listening, bringing her whole self to each brief encounter in a way that should have been impossible given the number of encounters and the brevity of each one. He watched and he felt the particular species of relief that is really love, the kind that only clarifies itself in the moment of almost loss. He felt it for Catherine. He felt it for William, who had come through those months with something harder and more real in his face, something that looked like a man who has been tested and has not broken. He felt it for the grandchildren, who were growing up inside a family that was, somehow, despite everything, despite all the centuries of dysfunction and all the personal failures and all the costs that had been paid by people who had not chosen to pay them, a family that had somehow produced people capable of loving each other. Camilla found him in the garden at Highgrove that evening. The public events were done. The cars and cameras and careful handshakes were done. It was just the two of them and the light going sideways through the hedges and the smell of the garden that he had spent 30 years making into something that expressed what he could not express in any other form. She put her hand in his. He held it the way he held it, firmly, without looking, as if the hand in his was simply a fact of the world that did not require comment. They stood there for a while, not speaking. There is a photograph from that evening too, though fewer people know about it. It is softer than the Windsor staircase image, less formal, taken by someone in the household who understood that the moment was private but could not resist the record of it. In it, Charles and Camilla stand side by side at the edge of the garden, his hand in hers, both of them looking at something outside the frame. Charles is not reaching anywhere. He is simply standing. Standing still, for once, next to the person who has known him longest. The silence in that image says something different from the Windsor staircase silence. It does not say everything he missed. It does not say everything he reached for and never quite touched. It says something quieter than all of that. It says, here. This. Still. The reaching does not stop. That would be too clean, too resolved, too much like a story that has decided how to end rather than a life that simply continues. Charles still looks at Catherine with that particular quality of attention. He still feels, in her presence, the specific warmth of the unlived life, the ghost of something that might have been different. He probably always will. It is too deep in him now, too old. You do not undo the longing of 70 years in an afternoon in a garden. But the longing has company now. Alongside it, holding its hand in the garden light, is something that took longer to arrive and, may be, in the end, more durable. Not the fire he sometimes sees in Catherine's house when he visits for the holidays and the children are loud and William is laughing and the rooms are full of people being genuinely glad to be together. Not the window he has pressed his hand against his whole life. Just the room. The quiet, warm, well-lit room. Camilla. The room he has been standing in for 20 years without always knowing he was already home. This is not a fairy tale. Fairy tales require a moment of revelation, a single turn of the lock, a door opening into different light. What this is, what Charles's story is, in its entirety, from the boy sent away to school to the king standing in his garden, is something more ordinary and more true than a fairy tale. It is a man who wanted more than he knew how to want, who reached and sometimes grasped and sometimes missed, who loved imperfectly and incompletely and at the wrong times and toward the wrong people and with the wrong tools, and who arrived, eventually, at something real. Not because he figured it out. Not because he changed fundamentally or shed the damage of his upbringing or became, in some redemptive final act, the warm and fully present man he might have been with different parents and a different childhood and a different country's expectations pressing down on his shoulders from birth. But because the people around him, Catherine with her warmth, William with his clarity, the grandchildren with their uncomplicated noise, and Camilla with her decades of patient, intelligent love, because all of them, in their different ways, kept making a space for him and kept leaving the door open and kept, somehow, waiting. He walked through. Late. Imperfectly. Still reaching in old directions sometimes, still pressing his hand against glass that is not his to open. But, inside, at last. The photographs keep being taken. The silence in each one says something different, something the caption writers and the royal correspondents reach for and cannot quite hold. They write about tension and preference and the complicated dynamics of the world's most scrutinized family, and they are not wrong, exactly, but they are not right either. What the silence actually says, if you look at enough of them, if you let the accumulation of images make the argument that no single image can make alone, what the silence actually says is this: a man. His life. The gap between what he wanted and what he got, and the smaller, quieter grace of finding that the gap is not as wide as he feared. The love he reached for, glowing in someone else's house, teaching him the shape of what love is. The love he stood beside, patient as a garden, already in bloom. Both real. Both his. The hand reaching right, and the hand held still in the evening light. Both, in the end, saying the same thing, the thing Charles had spent a lifetime trying and failing and, finally, slowly, learning to say. That he was here. That it mattered. That he stayed.